I think we are good to go. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. I'm starting this way because we have attendances from different time zones, from different parts of the world. So thanks for joining. This is Catapult webinar series, day 2. Don't forget that we already had the first day webinar with Steve Nightingale. Check out for the video of the webinar. And just as a reminder for you that we have 3 more days of webinars, so don't miss anything. Today, I'm really pleased to introduce Sports Performance Manager of Canadian men's ice hockey teams, applied sports scientist, and actually guru of our Catapult hockeyism, Adam Douglas. Adam, good morning. How's it going?
Hey, Vlad, thank you very much for the introduction.
Yeah. So really great pleasure that you found some time to share some experience and background of using wearables. So really pleased to see you actually. Right before we start, I'd like to ask you maybe some short question. Maybe some of our attendees will not have a chance to, let's say, see it till the end of the presentation, but I hope they will. So anyway, the question is, how would you describe, and actually the question was the same for the Steve Nightingale before. So how would you describe the reason why actually ice hockey teams would need to use wearables, and what's actually the reason for that? What do you think?
Well, I don't want to give away all the nuggets that are going to be coming up over the next webinar, but I would say, a big theme for what I'm going to talk about is information is power, and information that can be applied to the organization to have a better understanding of what's going on is really the reason why teams should use wearable technology. It provides a lens, an objective lens of what's happening on the ice. And for the longest time, especially in hockey, we've just relied on institutional knowledge of coaches, of strength coaches, of sports scientists. But now we can actually measure it. And when you measure something, then we can manage it and plan on what we're going to do with that information.
All right. So I think most of the information will be disclosed during the presentation. Yeah, the answer will be more obvious after the presentation.
Yeah, hopefully. And again, just like last week, if anyone has questions, more than happy to stay on and answer them for as long as we need to.
Yeah, I will have a Q&A section, so everybody will have a chance to ask the questions. So prepare them, put them in the chat, and we'll find the good answers for that. So I think we'll be good to go. Adam, you're welcome.
Perfect. Sorry. Thanks, Vlad. Hi, everyone. Great to be here. Morning for me here in Canada. I know afternoon and evening as we do have people from all over the world attending. And Vlad kind of kicked off a little bit about what I'm going to talk about. But today we're going to talk about integrating wearable data, but more importantly, the implementation of a system like Catapult and then actioning off of it and how it can help the organization. When I was building this presentation, Vlad and Marcus, who I was talking about kind of what we wanted to cover and what we should cover, I wanted to frame it around a lot of questions I've received over the years and talks with strength and conditioning coaches, but also sport ice hockey coaches, because hockey it's a unique sport in that, it's very traditional in nature. It's very traditional in implementation. And we're kind of behind a lot of those other sports when it comes to this high performance mindset and taking information and filtering that and putting it to people who are the decision makers. And a lot of those conversations always center around, okay, what does the system measure? How easy is it to implement? And who within the organization can use this data and information? And those are key rocks that a team, a person needs to understand before they start using a system like Catapult. It will increase your usage tenfold if you kind of have an idea of those questions beforehand. And so that's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to layer those kind of questions and answers together with specific use cases over my 7+ years of using the system, both as a client and then also now that I work with Catapult. And so the big rocks we're going to focus on today are the what and how behind the Catapult system. specifically for ice hockey. And for me, the biggest hurdle in implementation with teams is how. So that's going to be a big focus over the back half of our presentation. And, amongst all the conversations over the years, I always hear, this is something I want, especially from the strength coaches, this is something we want to do to help push our team forward and push our understanding forward. I just don't know how I can get buy-in from the whole organization, coaches, management, et cetera. So we framed a lot of that around how you can help those people, because the more people you can get invested into the system and using the information, the better the outcomes will be on the back end of it. So just a little bit about me. I know Vlad touched on it a little bit, but I do work with Catapult. I'm an applied sports scientist here in North America. I'm based out of Canada. And really my job is to oversee and work with all of our ice hockey clients, specifically here in North America, but I've pretty much talked with all of our clients across the world. I'm in charge of helping them understand their information. I'm also in charge and pushing some kind of research and development within the ice hockey space for Catapult. And that's my job. I also am in this unique space in that I'm also an applied practitioner. So I am the manager of sport performance with Hockey Canada's men's national teams. I've been with Hockey Canada over 10 years. Over the last 7 years, really focused with our World Junior, our under 20 program. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about today, I'm in the trenches already. We use this system. I figure out different ways of presenting data to coaches and athletes. And so it's really important to understand that, I wear two hats. And a lot of what I'm going to talk to is because I've been there and I've had to overcome a lot of these hurdles. Here's what we're going to talk about today. I'm going to go into a little bit of just kind of what is external load in ice hockey, kind of what wearables are, what the Catapult technology is, because I think that's very important to understand where we need to go down the road within the presentation. So we're going to talk a little bit of what does external load look like in hockey. I'm going to I've changed things a little bit. I'm going to pick up on a thread that Steve talked about last week, which is the internal external load. And then we're going to get into implementing. So once you understand the load, we're going to talk, okay, how could I figure out if I can use this with my team and organization, and how can I get it stuck into that? And then lastly, I'm going to share some ways you can impact the organization. Because if you understand what you want to measure and you have a plan to measure it, now we want to have that impact. Okay. One of the questions I get a lot of the times from practitioners and sport coaches alike is, okay, well, who uses this in ice hockey? And, I've been with Catapult 3 years now, and we've seen a lot of growth and we're continuing to grow, but our ice hockey impact is worldwide. My job is focused here in North America with our professional teams and our NCAA teams and helping those athletes and practitioners understand the information they get. And, we're slowly growing our European footprint a lot. One of the purposes of these webinars that Vlad and Marcus organized was to help coaches there understand what they're doing. And really that's what it all comes down to, is we want to provide information back to the organizations to help them understand what's going on the ice. Really quickly, this is the unit we're going to be talking about. Which is our newest vector unit. I'm going to be going into kind of positional versus inertial metrics, but the key thing to understand is when we talk about wearable technology, this is our vector. It's a inertial, measurement unit, like Steve talked about in IMU, but really we look at, force, direction, and acceleration, movement. Essentially, we measured all of the movements that happen on the ice. Typically, we measure it at 10 hertz. We can sample up to 100 hertz. It's good to remember that the higher sampling rates you go, the more inherent noise you can bring into the system. So most of our measurements are at 10 hertz. From a definitions perspective, and Steve kind of touched on, GPS. When everyone thinks about monitoring, they think about GPS. That's the first thing that comes to mind with wearable technology. We do have an indoor GPS system, which is our positional system called Clear Sky. That will give you all of the positional metrics that you need. But it's really important to understand that you can't just take a GPS unit, put it on a hockey player that plays inside in a building and expect to get positional data. It doesn't work that way. For us, our LPS system, or our local positioning system called Clear Sky, allows you to get that from a hockey perspective. Here in North America, typically most of the installs we do now is our Clear Sky system. You know, if teams can push that way, you know, I recommend it, because now we can get an understanding of accel deceleration and distances at certain speeds. Especially with a lot of our National Hockey League clients, they now have that information coming from an NHL system in game. So now we can better marry practice and game data to make sure we are exposing our athletes to the proper speeds and distances they need to. We've given them those exposures of max velocity that we know will help from an injury mitigation and performance standpoint. The next layer is our inertial system, and that's our most well-known when it comes to hockey. And that's using the accelerometer, the gyroscope, and the magnetometer to get an understanding of the movement demands from a volume and intensity perspective on the ice. One of the key questions I get is, well, can you use, you know, inertial when we go on the road? Yes, the inertial systems travel with you. It's just the unit that's worn between the shoulder blades. And so we can get that information when you go on the road. The positional data, that's hardwired installed. Clear Sky is hardwired into your rink, but the inertial data, that is what kind of fits the bulk or the spine framework of getting that understanding of what's happening on the ice. And then lastly, our units, they code to a heart rate monitor. We do have a built-in vest. If your athletes wear the vest against their skin, we can get their heart rate while they're skating in there. But really, when it comes to like what is, you know, wearable technology in the sport of ice hockey, this is it. You got your positional information, you've got your inertial information, and you have their heart rate information. Now, specifically to hockey, and breaking into the inertial system a little bit more, because that, as I said, that's our framework, or that's our backbone of the information we collect. We further break our kind of hockey suite, or our hockey metrics, down into 3 different buckets. The first one is volume. We want to have an understanding of all of the work that is done on the ice. And then there's various key metrics we can use to look at. But for us, it's an understanding of volume. The second is intensity, right? A lot of my PhD work was around understanding the application of intensity, and more importantly, the importance of intensity in a sport like ice hockey, an intermittent high intensity sport. We need to be able to measure that so we can manage it. And then lastly, one of the key concepts within the Catapult system for ice hockey is this opportunity to measure asymmetry. So Catapult has patented a stride detection algorithm from the information. So we can look at left and right strides as they skate down the ice. We can look at force application. We can look at number of strides. We can start to look at skating symmetry and understand, you know, that hockey is an asymmetrical sport, but each athlete has a skating signature or a skating fingerprint, and then understanding what deviations from that mean. Later on, I'm going to actually have a little bit of a case study working with one of the athletes that I worked with, where we identified an asymmetry. We used that information to help them in their return to play process. And it can be very valuable information as we start to talk about, you know, how can we use this information across the different layers. And return to play is a very strong use case for a system like Catapult. Now, one of the things we want to take to another layer is the understanding of where does heart rate fit in with all of this? Because I said heart rate's one of the key things that we've measured. And heart rate has always been something that's been easily measured in ice hockey. It was the first wearable on ice that people have. Now, one of the things I talk about when it comes to heart rate is, you know, heart rate gives us the response to something. So internal load, Catapult measures external load. That's the work that we do. Heart rate measures internal load. Sure, you can have trim, you can have max heart rate, but in the sport of ice hockey, you know, heart rate is easy to measure. People don't necessarily mind wearing the belts. kind of become ingrained in what people do within the sport. And, Steve touched on it briefly last week. And so now I want to dig a little bit more into, using an internal, external load information. And we're going to use our friends here from, the Nintendo gaming system of ice hockey. A lot of our older people's first exposure to the game. It certainly was one of mine when I was younger. But we're going to use this as an example of what heart rate gives you, what external load can give you, and more importantly, when we marry that together, the wealth of information that we can have. Because heart rate is something, as I said, people are familiar with in hockey. Okay, so I'm going to start these two skaters. So as they skate around the ice, just watch what they do. They're buzzing around. As we know, the bigger players in this game, they're a little bit slower, a little bit more methodical around the ice, where those little guys, they buzz all around. Now, if we actually had heart rate monitors on those guys, we have a duration of 10 seconds. That's fine. That's how long that clip was. But we can see two heart rates. Now, I've had conversations with coaches that broadcast heart rate, or they track heart rate in a practice, and they would say, player A, that big guy, he worked harder because he hit a max heart rate of 200. Whereas that little guy only hit a max heart rate of 185. He must not have been working hard. And for some reason, hockey coaches are always stuck into who's working hard and who's not. And, heart rate doesn't tell us a lot of that. Also, what did these athletes have that could have impacted their heart rate before they go on the ice? Caffeine, nicotine, hydration status. We know these things can impact heart rate. So from a simple sample, does heart rate tell us much within that? Certainly what we saw there as practitioners watching from the stands or from the bench, that big guy didn't, work harder, but he did hit a max heart rate. So really the question comes, who did more work and at what cost? As we start to kind of understand what heart rate can or can't tell us. Well, what if we add external load? So from player A, now we add our player load value, which from our Catapult system is one of our volume-based metrics. We can see that they only did 30 units of work and player B did 50 units of work. So now if I take my information from my heart rate and my information from my Catapult system, we can start to look at something called an efficiency index, okay, which is our internal load divided by external load. And we can start to figure out, what does that mean? Well, now we can see, and again, these are only 10-second snippets, so the numbers are relatively low, but we can see that player A had an efficiency index of 0.03 versus player one, who did more work at a lower heart rate, okay? So they have a lower efficiency index. And one of the things we know and we can understand is that this efficiency index can help us kind of gauge fitness versus fatigue, right? Over the course of a season, I actually want to try to bring players' heart rates down, because we know as players get fit and in game shape, and the fitter the athlete, the more able the more work they can do at a lower heart rate. Like the opportunity cost or the cost of doing work comes down. And so if we start to look at the ratio of internal to external load, we want to see that number come down. And there's thoughts out there that the lower the ratio, the increase or the higher opportunity to increase performance. I'm not going to say player B did what they needed to out on the ice to have a better performance, but we can start to look at that relationship of internal to external load to see how athletes are dealing with the stress. And if I just had one of those, I would say, player A, they were great, they worked harder. But player B actually did more work at lower metabolic or physiological costs, which is what we want. That's what I want to see from an athlete perspective. So what does that look like real world? Well, here's one of the kind of dashboard metrics that I look at on a daily basis with my athletes. In the top part, that's an internal external load change. So what I do is I take the athletes, work over the last, I think in this case it's 14 days, and I just create a Z-score every day based off the internal and external load. And then I plot that on my scale here, and I create my quadrant so I can see who is handling the load well, who is not, how is that changing over their time within that time window. And I put the lower one in because that just shows us our work over the last month. But that red dotted line is the start of training camp. So everything to the left of that red dotted line was what the athletes did before they came to our camp from our wearable technology. And then clearly you can see this is like a training camp scenario. So we have larger volume, which is why the athletes on the top graph are pushed towards that decreased load, because we're doing some volume work. But you can start to see some athletes, 38, 31 there, are handling the load pretty well. You know, we're still within kind of that one standard deviation gray box. The goal is to bring athletes back down, but the key here is we didn't have anybody having, you know, a decrease in external load change and an increase in internal load change. Because that's the one thing we don't want, right? We don't want that efficiency index to bias towards their internal load, meaning the work is becoming harder. Really interesting kind of anecdote from a graphing like this is we've actually been able to flag some sickness before athletes have actually presented with symptoms, because we see these changes in their internal load. So their external load's not changing. They're not moving very far from that gray box, but we start to see the cost of business going up. And, you know, one of the things we learned is, you know, these athletes are fit, they're in shape. So it wasn't a fitness issue. There must be something else going on. And sure enough, 2 or 3 days later, they start to come down with a head and chest cold. And we've had that with about 3 athletes that have presented in that. So it's really neat to see kind of how that, you know, the heart rate can be valuable information, but putting that together with your external load just provides you with another way to track your athletes and another way to monitor what's happening on the ice from a performance perspective. So lots of value there. You know, that heart rate is so important, but also it becomes even more important when you can combine that, because now you're understanding what's happening on the ice. And really, that's the whole point of a wearable technology system like Catapult, is we now understand what's happening on the ice. We know what those athletes are doing. We can measure it and we can monitor it. Okay, so now that we understand kind of what that external load is, now I want to talk about implementation. And this is the sticking point with a lot of the people I talk to, whether they're soon-to-be clients or practitioners who want to get into the technology space but don't know how to start. I want to walk you through the thought process and talk about how I went through it as well 7+ years ago when Hockey Canada decided to join Catapult. So when we think about implementation of technology, you know, a lot of hockey is keeping up with the Joneses. This team has it, so my GM says I want it. Well, that's actually one of the kind of the worst ways to implement, you know, technology or bring it into your system, is because you were told to. I like to see people go through a thought process, and I just kind of help them work their way through this flow chart. So if we break this off into 3 sections, the first one is expectation. What do you want to get out of the information that a system like Catapult can help? For me, when we started and when we were looking at it with Hockey Canada, you know, coming out of the Sochi Olympics in 2014, you know, we had done a really good job, but we still had some questions about how could we continue to improve what our athletes do on the ice. And for us and for pretty much anybody on this call, what happens on the scoreboard is the biggest, you know, key performance indicator. How can we keep our athletes performing well? What can we uncover? And really, it's understanding better what they do on the ice. We had measured with heart rate before. We had done all that. We had tried, you know, RPE scales. We had tried all of that, but none of it was working. But I still had this nagging question. And so we really wanted to fix a blind spot, which was what was happening on the ice. And, you know, were we able to use a system that could, you know, get us there and get a better understanding of volume and intensity on the ice and start to peel away those layers? The key thing here, and something I want to highlight, is these outs that you have as a practitioner. So the first one is, you know, who is going to be running the system? Is that going to be you as the head strength and conditioning coach? Is that going to be you as the high performance director? Is that going to be you as the assistant? Are you going to dump it to the assistant strength coach? If you can't answer that question, full stop right there. There's no need to figure out more technology. But as you work your way through and you have a plan for that, and you've understood the blind spot that you want, maybe you have the same, you know, problems I had. You just have these questions about, how can we better prepare and periodize what our athletes are doing on the ice? Then you got to figure out what the impact to the organization is. Okay. And, again, you could file it for later if it's not going to work, if you just don't have the bandwidth right now. But once you've identified that problem, now you need to start to evaluate. You need to do, as a practitioner, your homework. So when we were looking at this in 2015, 2014, 2015, there wasn't a lot out there, but there were some really smart people using it, had the opportunity to talk with them, had the opportunity to demo the system. I saw how easy it was to use. I saw the information we could get off our athletes. And then I started digging into the research. And, fortunately for me, I've had an opportunity to do a lot of research with the Catapult systems. That was the basis of my, PhD. I'm going to link a bunch of papers at the end, a lot of practical papers. But that is the biggest out if you're looking at any sort of technology. I don't care if it's Catapult. I don't care if it's any other system. If it's not valid and reliable, you do not want to use it. So that's another full stop right there. If the research literature, the papers are showing it's not valid and reliable, you don't want to use it. And again, I come back to, you look at it, you need to know what you're measuring and making sure that it's measuring exactly what you're doing. And I think a lot of technology companies early on, when they were trying to get into hockey, they couldn't figure out that they couldn't just take what they used on the field and how the skating stride is different and how it puts different stresses and different forces on the body to see how that impacted volume and intensity. Okay. So what's your evaluation process? Have you talked to other practitioners that are using it? Are you talking to other people that aren't using it and trying to figure out why, if you get good feedback? The last section is, once you've gone through that, is execution. And again, if the first entry point is, do I have the bandwidth to learn and implement this data? The second key piece to the implementation of this technology is, what is your execution plan? So you've gone through this whole flow chart. You have another opportunity here to say, yes, the data that I'm collecting or the information I'm getting helps me with the blind spot. So again, for us, that was getting an understanding of the actual work that was being done on the ice. And then what's the strategy to use it? Who's going to use it? What's the buy-in to the organization? How are you going to get the players on board? How are you going to get the management on board? And what's the plan? And really, that's where I start a lot of my conversations with people is, what's your plan? And if you don't have one, let's figure out one. Fortunately for me, we had a plan. We had lots of conversations. The organization was bought in. But I had the opportunity to talk to a lot of people outside of hockey about how they use Catapult, what did they look at, how they were going to use it. Now there's a lot of papers out there that can, talk about volume and intensity for ice hockey, how other people used it. Pierre Allard was on a webinar we gave last year and talked about how he uses it in his return to play process and how he was able to implement it there. That's great. 7 years ago, that wasn't there, but now, there's enough people around that can, show you how they use it. And hopefully that helps in your execution of it, because it's a dead system if you can't execute it and get buy-in. And one thing I talk about is, when we get to that execution system, is we need to figure out 3 layers for successful buy-in within an organization. All right. If you can get stuck in with these 3 key stakeholders, you're going to have success with the information. You're going to learn how to use it. You're going to start to understand it. But now you've got buy-in from all of the key decision makers within an organization. And, coaches and management, that's where I start. And, they're kind of the gatekeepers. Athletes are into it. And I'm going to break down how we can help each of these 3 layers. But once you have your execution in play, now it's, how can we help these 3 layers? And that's the biggest piece for this last system, is how can we make their job easier? How can we take the information to our coaches, to our therapists and our support staff, and more importantly, and lastly, to the players, to help them? Because really, we're all in the business of performance. And we know that if we can get this technology and use this technology to its fullest extent, we're going to help the organization. But how are you going to do that? So one of the ways that the strategies I've used with coaches and management is, I want to make their job easier. I want to present the information from practice or games to make their job easier. So one of the ways we do that is we provide feedback on practice flow. You know, you'll hear a lot of people talk about drill data banks, and I'm going to show you what that looks like on the next page. But if I can record and measure the volume and intensity of all of the practice drills we do, it makes their job easier to hit a target if we understand what the outcome of those drills are. So we do categorize drills and make a drill data bank. So when a practice happens, we edit and clip the drills. So now when I go in and help our coaches, they can figure out what they need to do from a technical, tactical perspective on that day. And then, you know, I'll say, okay, well, here, let's rank our drills by intensity. So on this chart, we're using skating load per minute. And we can say, okay, we want the highest skating intensity drills we have. How many of those fit the technical tactical outcome that you want today? Okay, well, we need to work on our 5-on-5 forecheck. So Huntsy 3-on-2 forecheck, our highest intensity skating drill that we have. Well, let's start there. So that's going to build a foundation of our practice, and then we need to move. And once you have an understanding of what that session goal for the day is, you know, whether it's a high intensity, low volume, or high volume, low intensity day, it becomes building drills very easy. So here's one of the things. This looks really messy, but I want to kind of walk you through, again, that thought process. So this is from one of our practices with one of the teams I work with. We needed an in-tournament practice. We wanted it low volume, okay, with a little bit of intensity sprinkled in. So I wouldn't call it a high intensity practice, but, you know, moderate, where we wanted exposure to intensity and then we back off a little bit. So over a 25-minute practice, we picked drills. So we used that drill data bank and that ranking to pick 2 drills that would fall into our high intensity, low volume quadrant. So circled there in the top part. And then, you know, flow drills, those are a big thing in hockey, warm-up drills. We wanted to, you know, fill out the rest of that time by giving them some of that, exposure to their game, warm up their hands, that sort of thing. So there we picked 3 low volume, low intensity days, put 2 low volume, high intensity days. We put those at the end of practice so we could kind of use those to ramp into the session. And we took the guesswork out of it. We knew what our highest intensity drills were. We knew what our low volume, low intensity drills were, and our coaches could easily plan what they needed to sharpen that spear, so to speak, or be really specific in the application of our drills for them. The other thing, to make their job easier and to sell them is an intensity tracker. I mentioned it earlier. The question you always get from hockey coaches is, how intense was the session? But more importantly, who worked hard that session? Well, for me, as I said, a lot of my work has been around intensity and using that as one of our key performance indicators. And so understanding the workloads that we do on a daily basis to help guide that intensity and what is our focus. So here, one of the things I do on my coaching reports for practices is I show our coaches, this is the intensity we did today as it relates to our last 3 days. So if we look at that practice on December 22nd, we can see that it was lower volume and lower intensity than what we did on the 21st, but we were coming off, a high volume, high workload day, heading into a game on the 23rd. So that's fine. And it's about how we can use that information to help the coaches understand what we did today and what we need to do tomorrow and how that fits with what we've done. So you're just, again, providing them information and framing it in a way that helps them do their job. And then lastly, as I said, everyone wants to know, who worked the hardest. Well, we can use that. One of the key metrics I use is high intensity work duration, which essentially is a stopwatch, so to speak, that when the accelerometer, measures an athlete moving above a certain threshold, it starts that stopwatch. And then when they come below that work threshold, it stops it. And so we can look at the accumulation over a game, over a practice to start to understand, who worked hard and who didn't. There's education behind that, okay, as well. because I never want to set up our athletes to fail. We actually post this in our locker room so players can understand, kind of where they fit within their position. A lot of it has to do with exposure, right? If you're a top line player, you're probably going to get more reps. And so you might have more of an opportunity to gain high work. A lot of it's education for younger athletes to say, hey, do you have a little bit more? Can you give us a little bit more? Where are you in relation to your positional average for your group? I also want athletes to find their D partner or their line mates and say, are you guys clustering together? Because chances are you typically would have had the same opportunity to do work. So let's make sure we're working around the same, same thresholds. But now there's really no hiding it. And again, it's another one of, if it's not a high volume day, these numbers shouldn't necessarily be that high, but maybe they're high for the guys that need to do more work. So our scratches, it's a great metric to track, which I'm going to show you, because we can start to look at, based off time on ice, what should certain players get from a high intensity work duration accumulation? And then we can use that to drive some specific on ice demand. That next layer within those layers is our support staff. So typically our physiotherapists, our athletic therapists, how can they use the system? Well, one of the things we can do is we can do an early identification of skating asymmetry. So using our left and right stride outputs, we can start to fingerprint when athletes' norms are happening and just check in. It's not necessarily raising a big red flag, but we want to check in. So here's an athlete. So what we're looking at here is a Z score of the highest band. So an athlete's highest output stride force, left and right. And what we can see is, through a lot of this, they're relatively within the green, but this area I've highlighted, we had 3 sessions that kind of fell, between 1 to 2 standard deviations. And it's just a kind of like an early warning system. What's going on? Well, for this athlete, we just wanted to check in on their hips and groin, spend a little bit more time on the table, try to figure out what's going on. And from a context perspective, what we did is we, with this specific athlete, we had, some practices. We had about a week's of practice. Then we had to quarantine. So coming out of that quarantine, the athlete spun a little bit high, and then, this was a response to that. So they just needed a little bit more soft tissue work, a little bit more core activation to really kind of get them back. We saw another little dip, but that was a one-off, so we're not really too concerned about that. And then as we kind of climb here, we can start to see, try to figure out kind of what's going on. But it just helps with an early identification system of flagging norms, but more importantly, when that athlete deviates from that norm. And we know hockey's an asymmetrical sport, so I don't look at just left and right. I want to look at that athlete's change of their skating load ratio at the highest outputs. And I mentioned earlier, now I'm going to talk a little bit about return to play. And this is where there is a ton of value in using objective information measured while they're skating, because you can use it to guide the return to play process, and you can use it to help you and the athlete understand what's going on. So here's an athlete. They had an injury. So they took a shot off the foot, deep bone bruise in the foot. Now, my athletes and the way I work is, we get them for, training camps in certain periods of time. So this is just a small snapshot, but everything to the left of that injury, we used that as their normative data. Okay. So sessions 1 through 8 is the athlete's normative data. Then we have an injury. We took them off the ice for a while. We did some rehab, and now we needed to bring them back on the ice. So we have this kind of really focused return to play process. We also have this period of time between the injury and that return to play process where the athlete was trying to figure things out, trying to skate before, we really kind of pulled him to focus on some of that specific stuff. But if we use our stride force ratio when the athlete was healthy, we know that his norm is +4, meaning he's biased a little bit more to his right, but that's his normal. We're never going to get him to 0. We don't want to get him to 0. We want to get him to +4. But as we start to look at his return to play data, he's not there. I think his highest through the lightning bolt to the green box was like +28. So we got him to +14. And then when the lines come close together, we got him back to +5. So right within his norm. And we can just use that information to help guide it. We weren't rushing this athlete back. We wanted to make sure we were trending back to normal. So from 28 to 14 down to 5, to help our athlete and our support staff understand that, yes, what we're doing is working to get this athlete back healthy. Okay. The other thing we can do is we can help guide the intensity of our return to play skates. One of the most subjective parts of return to play is that last critical kind of piece when the athlete needs to get back. You know, you're trying to get them back healthy with the rest of the group, but what exposure did you give them to finally clear them, kind of check that last box? And so one of the things we can do is we can look at their capability or their capacity to sustain and handle high intensity work duration. So depending on where the athletes fall within the roster, you know, using some of my game data, we know that if you're a group 1 athlete, so as a forward, you're playing greater than 16 minutes, in a typical game, you accumulate between 42 to 60% of your time on ice as high intensity work duration. And then that just gets stratified based off your position. So if your place within the kind of the forward group. So if you're an 11 to 16 minute guy, that number changes a bit. And then if you're playing less than 11 minutes, if you're playing less than that, you know, we have another time box for you. So we can use that over those last few sessions to say, yes, you're clear. Yes, your asymmetry has come back to what your normative values are. And yes, you have the capacity to handle high intensity work duration because we've been able to push that back, and you can handle what you would in a game. And, you know, this goes really well for scratched players as well, because we can show them how it can help them. So one of the things that, you know, the teams that I've worked with, we've tried to do is be very specific with the information we give to the athletes of how it can help them. Because that's the biggest thing an athlete wants to know is, if I'm going to use this system, if I'm going to put my trust in you to measure some numbers on me, how can it help them? Well, you know, if I keep going with that rehab focus, we can show the athletes that they're getting better, right? Their ratios are coming down. We can show them that there's that, you know, mental piece that you are getting better, which has been a big breakthrough for a lot of our athletes. But we can also help in the developmental process of healthy athletes by being specific in their scratch skates. So, you know, I don't want to say back in the day because it still happens now, but, you know, if an athlete's not playing and they're scratched, they're going to get bag skated. But what we try to do is be really specific in, okay, what does this athlete need to help them be a better hockey player? What are the drills we can do? But more importantly, how much accumulation of high intensity work duration do we need this player to get in these skates so they're ready to play if called upon? So we're not just doing work for work's sake. You know, we can look at, if it's a power forward, you know, we can break down our time percentage in shift. Okay, this athlete needs 52% of their time on ice is spent in those higher threshold bands. So let's make sure he's accumulating that in those scratch skates in a way that's going to help their development. And we've had a lot of great success with that, and getting players to understand that we're being very specific in what we're asking them to do on the ice. And it has helped a lot of buy-in, because we can show them this information, show them how it's, you know, tell them how it's going to help them, but more importantly, show them how it's helping them and how we're being very specific in what we're doing. Similar to what we do in the gym. My background is a strength and conditioning coach, and athletes understand specifics in the gym, how it's going to help them. The ice is no different. And then lastly, you know, modern players love this kind of stuff. They're information hungry. You know, they've grown up with video games. They've grown up with, you know, other pro sports, the NFL, and the data showing how fast and how far people are running. Athletes like to know this. You know, I just grabbed a quick screenshot. That's me there, just kind of getting set up, and we were split practice. So we practiced, we flooded. Guys are going back out on the ice. They want to see how much high intensity work they accumulated in that first session. You know, so I was just standing there with our iPad, you know, and guys are filtering on the ice. How much did I work? How much did I work? Where am I in my position? How much did I work? They love that information, you know, and more importantly, they know that what we're doing is helping them and the team in the long run. And so the modern player, I don't want to say they expect it, but it's becoming the new norm for them, is to have some numbers and information and be very kind of analytical about their own development, which has been great. The modern player, we've seen this real big shift over the last few years, and it's only going to grow and gain momentum and steam as we go. So really quickly, just to summarize, the kind of the three big things we talked about, right? So external load data informs the training process. If we can measure something and we can monitor it and we understand the impact that can have as we start to play around with the variables of volume and intensity, it becomes a valuable tool to help your organization and help your practice as a practitioner. Okay, more importantly, what's that blind spot? Do you have the capacity and the bandwidth to take in and ingest the data and monitor it? But what's the plan? Because data collection is a menial task if you're not going to action off it. So what's the plan? And then as you put that plan and execute it and put it into practice, the key thing you need to understand is, how can the data help the different layers of your organization? How can you help your coaches? How can you help your support staff? And more importantly, how can you help those athletes understand you're in a position to help them and help the team perform at their maximal potential? Thank you very much for listening today. I'll leave this slide up. Just here's a lot of the applied hockey papers that have used Catapult from myself, from Pierre, Kevin Neal, the Boston Bruins has started to push a lot of great applied research using wearable technology on the ice. And really excited to see where this field goes over the next few years. So Vlad, I'll throw it back to you, but thank you very much, everybody, for listening.
Thanks, Adam. Thanks for the presentation. We have a bunch of questions to you. So the first one is from Robert Anderson. What is the main benefit of using Catapult against special tracking system alone, such as ice hockey?
Well, for me, there's a few things. I've only used Catapult, so I'm going to be a little bit biased in my answer. Plus, I work for the company, but there's a few key things that kind of separate Catapult from me. Number one is our stride detection algorithm. Like I talked a lot about that in the return to play process. That provides you that key layer of asymmetry that we can start to look at on an individualized basis for those athletes. Some of the technology companies out there, they've just taken what they've done in other sports and tried to put it to ice hockey. Catapult has put the research and development into their system to understand what happens on the ice, how it is different than running, and then how practitioners can apply that information. For me, another big piece was the validity and reliability. The Catapult technology itself, there's numerous third-party peer-reviewed literature out there that can give you the validity and reliability of that information and of those units. And you can start to look in and understand that, what I'm putting on the athletes is going to measure what I want it to, and the outcome is specific to hockey.
All right. Then one more question from Robert. Could we get the full reference for the implementation of the technology slide workflow?
Absolutely. More than happy to share everything. A lot of that, the reference is that slide. I had adopted from, there's a researcher at Stanford who just kind of does some technology stuff. There's no real paper behind that. That's just kind of the workflow and the thought process, but more than happy to share my slides with anybody who needs them after.
Yeah, I think maybe the attendances can get in touch directly with you or through our marketing team. So it doesn't matter. Yeah.
Absolutely. Here's my contact information is on this slide, whether it's social media or email. By all means, email me. More than happy to help anybody who needs it.
Okay, question from Steve Nightingale. Internal/external load metrics. What metric do you use to quantify internal load? Is it a TRIMP or something else?
Yeah, I use a modified TRIMP score. TRIMP was based out of endurance-based sport, and a lot of it doesn't necessarily capture a high-intensity intermittent sport like hockey, but what the modified TRIMP that I use is biased towards those higher intensity values. So my weighting factor is higher for the time spent in that zone 5 or zone 6. So I use a modified TRIMP, which I think does a great job of measuring and the different type of internal load or that response to the external load that they do. So TRIMP is mine. Another kind of key performance indicator from an internal load perspective is red zone minutes. So heart rate above 85%. I still think that's valuable to track. It's nice to layer in with that high intensity work duration.
All right. Another question in that it's a question on symmetry. Is there a certain amount of asymmetry to be expected in the skating stride of a hockey player based on their handedness? Yeah.
Yeah, yes, there is. And that's where I talk about, we need to understand the fingerprint or the skating signature of each athlete. So I would never look at a metric like skating load ratio and expect to see a number, because it's biased by handedness, but it's also biasness by what side of the ice they play on. And how many times they go around the net on their left leg or their right leg, because that's going to change it. But it's a longitudinal metric. So, that if I go back to that, highest output. So I always want to see what the highest output is from a asymmetry perspective, because, you can't hide at your highest threshold outputs. But I just look at each guy's individual ratio, and I would graph each individual player. Each individual player gets their own graph. And I just scroll through that to see who's moving outside their norm and who's deviating from it. I don't really care if it's positive in their right-handed shot or it's biased to the left if they're a left-handed shot. I just want to see what's normal for that athlete. And then more importantly, when do they start deviate from that normal?
All right, thank you. Another one, is the stride force ratio calculated from the accumulated values? Example, their total left force from the session with their total right force from the session. Other symmetry Z scores based on the player's individual Z scores or team. So I think it's partly answered, yeah, from the previous question, but yeah.
Yeah. So we look at individual. So an output metric like that, I want to look at each individual athlete and compare each individual athlete only to themselves. I'm never going to compare it to somebody else. Certainly, as I said, an output metric like that. The other question is, yes, we look at the global. You could look at it by drill if you wanted to. Typically, we look at the session because it's an accumulation metric as well. We want to see kind of what they've accumulated, and it's the resultant force, per stride. So we can look at that left and right. We get our kind of our skating load ratio from that. We can look at it at different thresholds, and that's, if you think of your skating stride as kind of low, medium, and high, we can look at each of those individually, or we can look at those collectively.
Okay. Thoughts on the potential drawbacks of using the session RP as a proxy for internal load if you have the external but no heart rate monitors? So love the adaptation matrix chart and want to come up with a way we can incorporate that. So as I understand the question, that is, can we use RP as internal, let's say, metric in this case?
Yeah. So one of the things that one of the reasons we kind of push to a better monitor of the work being done is I ran some analysis from a lot of our kind of Hockey Canada athletes that we were collecting RPEs, we were collecting heart rates, we were collecting all of that. And there was a strong correlation of RPE to duration. So athletes had this perception that the longer they stayed out on the ice, the harder they worked. And it didn't matter if the session was easy or not, the longer they stayed out on the ice. And I think a lot of that is, you're in the skates, you're in your equipment, you're on the ice for a long time. There's that mental load, mental fatigue. So it can be good that way. I struggle with using RPE as your main monitoring metric because of that. Because I never found it was a good, clean disassociation from duration. So yes, it can. There's lots of great applied research in other sports about RPE as an internal load metric. And as long as you're consistent and you anchor the athletes and you follow the same chart, yeah, sure, it could be good. I've seen enough research that it's a valuable metric. I just have some questions of it being your main key metric, especially because I've seen so much of its correlation with duration.
So it can be used like as additional ones, but in many cases it's like subjective, you mean?
Yeah, it's, for me, objective will trump, the majority of subjective metrics. Subjective metrics are I like to track subjective metrics when I try to figure out how an athlete is perceiving their ability to handle load. So from a wellness questionnaire, how did you sleep? How fatigued are you? How sore are you? Those are all subjective questions, and they form a layer of your monitoring system. But for me, my kind of flow chart of my total monitoring package is external load first, internal load to show the response to the load. Then it's the subjective metrics. How are they handling that load? And then we'll make our decision coming out of that.
Okay, another question from Philip. Have you compared on ice load and off ice load? For example, a lower body strength session.
Yeah, so the one of the things that I try to do is this could be a whole nother webinar, but a kind of a philosophy or a way of thinking I actually picked up from another practitioner named Daniel Bove, who works with the Phoenix Suns. But he has this quadrant system where he tries to match the off-ice stress or the off-court stress of the day with what they did on the ice. So a high volume, high intensity day on the ice, they would do some intensity in the gym. A low volume, low intensity day, they wouldn't necessarily do a high volume, high intensity day in the gym because they want to balance that stress. So you're trying to match that stress with what they did. And one of the nice parts about if you're measuring what's happening during the day, whether it's in the gym or on the ice, you have an understanding of what's going to happen that day. So you can plan accordingly. And I think there's so much information on there about matching stress because the body just handles stress as stress. It doesn't know really if I'm in the gym or on the ice. So if we're talking, the whole point of load monitoring is managing and monitoring stressors on the body. We want to make sure we're matching that stress. So a lot of what we would do in the gym would match whatever the outcome on the ice is, whether you're training before or after, it doesn't matter. We want to make sure we're setting the athlete up for success. And we have that undulating periodization thought process.
Okay. Last question. Do you scale your training efficiency calculation? The equation you presented assumes a linear relationship between the internal and external load metrics.
So that was just like a very iterative example. For me, I've done a few different ways. We've taken the log of those. Jace Delaney has some great information out there if you want to look more into the training efficiency index. I plot TRIMP, and so for that matrix, I will take daily TRIMPs and daily external load and look at the Z score of those over the athlete's last 14 days or 30 days, depending on how often they're with us and what window of adaptability I want to see. But as I said, Jace Delaney, who's with the Boston Celtics now, he's put out some great information, papers and his blog about training efficiency index and kind of how you can do some of that mathematical stuff. But for me, I just look at the session. So I do just look at TRIMP for the day and player load, external load for the day, and how those change and what we're looking for and how the athlete is changing off their normative values within that window of adaptability that we're looking at.
Okay, question from me. I think this is the last one because nobody adding the questions in the chat. So yeah, how would you evaluate the importance of inertial metrics against the metrics we can get from clear sky? Like, is it like something very important to have from data from clear sky, or inertial data is enough to analyze and make conclusions and planning? So
they're different layers of the onion, right? So the nice part about the inertial system is whether you're home or on the road, that's going to be your foundational metrics. So you're going to be able to measure that anytime an athlete goes on the ice. So that's going to be your base metrics, or what you're going to measure. The positional allows another layer of information. So as you peel away the layer of the onion, we can start to look at some output-based metrics, max velocity. For me, one of the best, things to track from a positional perspective is on the ice is distance at certain speeds. So, hockey is usually played around 85% of an athlete's max velocity. I don't think, max velocity or total distance total distance isn't a great metric anyway, but max velocity, good. You can see if an athlete's hitting that, but I want to see accumulation at certain, percentages of their max velocity. And that's where I think the positional metrics come into play, because now we can really start to understand, is this athlete capable of covering X amount of distance at, 85%? And is that changing? And if it's changing, why is it changing?
Okay. Yeah, pretty clear. Okay, thanks, Adam. Thank you very much. It was a good chance to share some hints on using wearables in ice hockey. Really good to see you here. And thanks everybody for joining. The recording of the webinar will be sent to the emails, or can be found in our portals. Don't forget that next week we have 2 more webinars, and yeah, all of them will be ice hockey specific as well, so you will get a reminder. For now, I'm really saying thank you to you, Adam, and thanks all for joining.